I need to talk after doing some reading about debt. Now, I maintain, Tana, you've heard me say this several times in our production meetings, that one of the things that my generation certainly didn't benefit from, and I don't think yours either, yours not so far from mine,
Yes.
is that the Jamaican school curriculum doesn't place an emphasis on teaching students, not just children, students about debt and debt management. And we have been raised to believe that debt is the worst thing in life that you could ever happen to you, is to owe somebody, which is rubbish. Yeah? Debt is a good thing. It can be a very good thing. And of course, it can also be a damaging thing, a devastating thing, a destructive thing. And when a country borrows and borrows heavily, by borrowing and borrowing heavily, that alone doesn't create a problem. The terms of the arrangement, the details of such, that's crucially important. And then it is what you see as an outcome of that which you have borrowed to do. So if you have borrowed over time heavily, and you look around you and you see the development and you can feel the development, then that is debt well accumulated, in my view. But when you look around you and you struggle to see what is the result of all that we have borrowed over time, then that becomes problematic. So, Tom and I went into my lab on the weekend and I found some numbers from the BOJ. And even though in passing I would say to you that, well, perhaps in this year debt was this, and as a percentage of total revenue, government revenue, it was this, the percentage was this. Looking at the raw numbers startled me because they tell a story of opportunities lost. Because again, the accumulation of the debt is not the problem. It is the terms of the borrowing. It is the interest payments. It is when you look around you, do you see the result of the borrowing? And when you're answering no to that very important question, that's when it suddenly becomes a huge problem. So here are the numbers. The base year I have here is 1990 to 91, that fiscal year. In that year, domestic debt, 2.8 billion. External debt, 1.98 billion. Total debt, 4.8 billion. Total revenue, 9.6 billion. So our total debt, external and domestic, 4.8 billion. Total revenue, 9.6 billion, which would mean that the total debt servicing as a percentage of total revenue would be 49.9%, call it 50%. That's good. 1990-91. And the debt didn't move significantly across the 1991 fiscal year, 91-92, 92-93. It moved sharply though. Between 1993-94, that fiscal year, and 94-95, domestic debt in 93-94 was 6.9 billion. But for the fiscal year after 94-95, it jumped to 18.4 billion, the domestic debt. External debt, 93-94, 9 billion. A year later, it moved to 14 billion. Our revenue across those 2 years only increased by 11 billion. So we had debt 93-94 to 94-95, increasing by a combined total, when you combine the domestic debt and the external debt, it increased by 17 billion, and our revenues only increased by 11 billion. That's where the problem started, because now, clearly, debt servicing way up here, revenue below that, you're running a deficit now. You're in a negative position. Between 95-96, domestic debt, 17.9 billion. The fiscal year after that, 96-97, it had jumped from 17.9 billion to 35.9 billion domestic debt. That's 18 billion added on. External debt didn't change much, but our revenue for those two fiscal years only grew by 4 billion. So you see that now? Domestic debt gone up by 18 billion, the debt servicing, and your revenues only grew by 4 billion. Bigger problem, and you're coming from years before where your debt servicing was running well ahead of how much you were collecting in revenue, your deficit growing bigger. Between 98-99, this now is a big problem here. 98-99 fiscal year, domestic debt 48.3 billion. The fiscal year after that, it jumped from 48.3 billion to 74.1 billion. Yeah? 4 billion less short of 30. So $26 billion was added to the domestic debt servicing cost between the 98-99 fiscal year and the 99-2000 fiscal year. So you ask yourself, so all right, George, if domestic debt between those two fiscal years alone jumped by 26 billion, what happened to revenue? Revenues in that time, they grew by 16 billion, but still running your debt running above your revenue. By the time you went into the 2000s, by the way, the first time our debt breached the 100 billion mark was in the 2001-2002 fiscal year. It moved to 117 billion domestic debt. External debt was 24 billion that year. Between 2002-2003 and 2003-2004, between those two fiscal years, the domestic debt jumped by $52 billion approximately. 52 billion. Revenues grew impressively that period as well by 32 billion. But come down now to the point 2008-2009. Domestic debt 188 billion. The fiscal year after, it ballooned to 251 billion. And by this time, the revenues weren't keeping pace. So the picture I'm trying to paint here, is how the debt that we were accumulating, both domestic and external. I'm focusing on the domestic debt line, but there's also an external debt line that is growing year over year from 1991 fiscal year to the end of the data set 2009-2010. It just kept getting bigger. And it wasn't getting bigger because we were borrowing more to do things. The debt servicing was getting bigger because the interest charges were just running out of hand. And then again, the interest charges were running out of hand because it was not cheap money that we were borrowing. The interest rates were significant, and the terms and everything else. And of course, the Jamaican governments over time, successive administrations, priority on paying down the debt, external and domestic. But your revenues are not keeping pace, and you find yourself spending out almost all of the budget. Almost all of what you collect, you're spending it out to pay down debt. Nothing left to really move the country forward. That's the situation we had. Now, because of the work of both administrations, PNP and JLP, yeah, the Labour right them are going to say, boy, George, no, it's the JLP alone fix it. Not quite. Not true. I maintain the economy in the hands of Dr. Phillips. There were several important things that needed to be done that were done to allow the Holness administration, Audley Shaw first and then Nigel Clark, to put us in order where the debt is now manageable and we're no longer among the most indebted countries in the world. And crucially, you're looking around and you're seeing evidence of government revenues at work. You see the investments in public infrastructure. You see the investments in transport. You see the investments in the social safety net. You see the investments in education, notwithstanding the fact that we're not getting the outcomes that we're paying for. You see a government able to use $100 billion of taxpayers' money to increase salaries in the public sector. Never knew I'd live to see that, and I'm not old. And as the example we always use here, you see government revenues, FIMI and FIO money, not IMF money or World Bank money or European Bank for Reconstruction and Development money, as used to happen in the past, paying for those things. Our taxpayers' money by bus. So that's the situation at the table now. But for many, many years, we borrowed foolishly somewhat. We borrowed and had to take the interest rate on offer because our affairs weren't in order. And we ended up shelling out billions to service external and domestic debt and not having enough to spend locally on services and infrastructure. We forget in 2009, when the announcement of a wage freeze was delivered in a national broadcast by the former Prime Minister Bruce Golding, who, we forget, told the nation he was taking a 15% pay cut and asked parliamentarians to take a 10%. The government did it, opposition didn't. Savings was about 8.9 million, thereabouts, called it $9 million. As a symbolic gesture because you're asking public sector workers to take a wage freeze. The IMF arrangement, the standby arrangement, $1.27 billion that went south under Shaw, was because the public sector workers said, look, we're tired of wage freeze. The police took them to court. And they had to follow through, paying the retroactive 7% increase. And of course, paying it going forward, which broke the back of that IMF agreement. We were borrowing, using borrowed money to pay higher salaries. That is not the case anymore. This is not an endorsement of JLP policies that have delivered us to this point. This is a commentary on where the country has moved forward. Two, it is an acknowledgement that successive administrations have had the discipline, the fiscal discipline, to put the fiscal house in order. So when I hear people talk about what's the use in building new revenue collection centers, I say, well, only someone unaware could say that. Because if we can collect more revenue and make it easier for people to pay taxes, and those who don't go pay the taxes don't because them no want to go online, and of course they don't want to join a line. More revenues, greater capacity for the government to act. So I'm saying this morning, for what we have borrowed over time and what we have paid back, we're starting to see those benefits now. But we wasted many decades, well, perhaps two, borrowing and spending and have nothing to show for it. We're looking to pay people with borrowed money, buy bus with borrowed money, fix road with borrowed money. That is not the case on this day in sports.